Welcome back to the Legacy Warriors podcast, where we break down the top two feeder leagues to the UFC. We got the LFA, but this week we're going to be talking about a Cage Warriors doubleheader. Cage Warriors 184 goes down on Friday afternoon, and it has about a 8-fight card lined up, whereas on Saturday afternoon they have a 16 card lined up to go down on UFC Fight Pass. I'll be breaking down Cage Warriors 184 on this segment, and then tomorrow I'll be dropping the Cage Warriors 185 breakdown, so stay tuned for that. Just a quick plug, if you're wondering how I know what I know about these fighters, there was only one place where I was able to do my researching with guaranteeing that I'm getting as many direct links to past fights for these fighters. That's the MMA Fight Archive. The link for that is in the description below. There's a 7-day free trial, and we just surpassed 5,000 fighter profiles for you to browse through and ensure you're leaving no stone unturned. Again, check out the MMA Fight Archive 7-day free trial, link in the description below. It's great if you do your own researching, predicting, and breaking down fights. It's your one-stop shop, I promise you that. All right, like I said, Cage Warriors 184 going down, 8-fight card here, headlined by a somewhat short notice main event between Anthony Orozco and Andre Augusto. So without further ado, let's get right into breaking down these fights. First fight up, we got Brandon Guest coming in at minus 260, going up against Loic Pillon, who comes in at plus 200. Now, Guest dropped his Cage Warriors and pro debut last time around against Charles Joyner, a very tough matchup for him, where he was facing a fellow striker who just had the range and, reach advantage, who was able to keep him at bay. Guest is a Muay Thai based fighter. He has some solid training partners like former UFC fighter Scott Askham. He's been training along Louis Sutherland as well. Has some very good striking of his own, especially when he's not at a huge disadvantage like he was last time against Joyner. I expect him to showcase a much more complete version of his game this time around as he goes up against a guy in Luke Pillon, 36 years old, returned to action after 11 years away from the sport last time around, where he was able to get a third-round TKO victory over his opponent, who's also coming off a 9-year layoff of his own. So Pillon looks to be more of a slugger, looks to be a very bloated light heavyweight as well. Doesn't obviously be looking to take the sport all too seriously as of late, and I really think that we'll see Guest actually run over him in this spot. I think he'll be the better technical striker. I think his physicality advantages will allow him to get to the target a little bit quicker, showcase a little bit more power, and I think within 10 minutes he ends up finishing Pillon with relative ease. All right, next up, we got Mitchell Goode coming in at plus 220, going up against Farshad Nazarnia, who comes in at minus 280. With Goode, you're talking about a BJJ brown belt who was able to snatch victory out of the jaws of defeat last time around, as he was getting grinded out by the stronger and more physical Angus Hewitt. But in the last 30 seconds of that matchup, he was able to throw up a buggy choke and eventually force the tap from his opponent. Normally, he utilizes some decent footwork and utilizes his length and reach to try to touch his opponents up, but the majority of his wins on the amateur scene came by submission, and a lot of it has to do with this slick submission approach. He's going up against a tough and durable and very physical Farshad Nazarnia, who came up short in his Cage Warriors debut back in September against Nel Ariano, who I'll be talking about very shortly here. Nazarnia normally utilizes a very physical and wrestle-heavy approach, but last time around we saw him drop down to 185 pounds, where he looked in incredible shape, and he smushed his opponent within 30 seconds, showcasing that he could be a problem at this weight class, especially if he gets the weight cut down and he continues developing at the rate that he is alongside those guys over there at Team Renegade. Like I said, strong grappler, strong wrestler, very good top presser, and usually finds a good job, or does a good job in terms of finding his way to a dominant position to eventually find the finish on his opponents. I think he'll be able to shut down the BJJ of Goode here. I think his strength and physicality will be a big factor in him winning this matchup, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's able to actually muster up a finish as well. But I do like Nazarnia here. I don't mind about the chalk, and I think he ends up getting his hand raised inside the distance. All right, next up, Craig McGrattan coming in at minus 145, going up against Luca Finocchio, who comes in at plus 115. McGrattan making his Cage Warriors debut with a 2-0 record, training out of Team KF, which is a great camp, especially for younger fighters. They got the Shelley brothers as well, a couple other notable Cage Warriors prospects coming out of that gym. Normally does a great job in terms of crashing the pocket, changing levels, dragging his opponents to the ground, and keeping them there as well. One thing I love about his grappling game is that he often attacks the base of his opponents whenever they're trying to work back to their feet. So if they're, if it's an open cage takedown and they're trying to scoot their butt back to the cage, he does a great job in grabbing onto their wrists and forcing them onto their back so he can establish more of a dominant position. From there, he works to finishes pretty quickly, and he loves utilizing his elbows to inflict massive damage, which usually ends to him finishing his opponents. He's a high-level prospect, great cardio, passable striking, but it's really his grappling that sets him apart from the rest of his competition. Now, he's going up against Luca Finocchio, who is out of Italy, but also has trained out of Serra-Longo. You often see him alongside Aljamain Sterling and Dennis Bazookia. Showcases a solid striking game where he's been able to put together a 2-0 professional run so far, although both of his opponents were 0-2 opponents, but he showcased what he should have, and that was a solid striking game. He did get taken down in the first matchup there, and I believe that's where the openings for McGrattan will end up coming. I don't doubt that Finocchio will be battling those takedown attempts and might even shuck off a few of the initial ones, but I think the repeated takedown attempts and the repeated pressure and just constant pressure, I should say, of McGrattan will eventually prove fruitful, and I think that will allow McGrattan to get that position that he needs on the ground. I don't know if he'll get the finish, as I think Finocchio will showcase some decent resistance, but I think for the most part we'll see Finocchio having to work off of his back and defending takedowns, which will allow the Irish fighter to end up getting his hand raised here. So I do like Finocchio at minus 145. All right, next up, Nel Ariano coming in at plus 165, going up against Danny Hartwell, who comes in at minus 205. Now, this line has kind of been jumping a little bit. I saw it all the way down to about plus 115 for Ariano. Now he's up at plus 165 within the last hour of me, starting this the recording for this podcast. So it seems like a ton of love coming in for the Aussie fighter. He is we'll start off on the Ariano side, who normally utilizes a solid discipline and educated striking game, utilizing his length and reach to pick opponents apart from distance, and not really chasing finishes, but more so looking to land damage so that he can hurt his opponents and set up the rest of his game. Last time around against Farshad Nazarnia, butchered it, he utilized a little bit more of a grueling grinding game. I think he wanted to match Nazarnia in that realm, and he showcased that he was the more physical fighter, pushing him against the cage, dragging him to the ground, even pulling off a nasty reversal as well when he did find himself on his back. But he seems to be a complete fighter, but obviously still having to work on his experience and trying to level up his game a little bit more. But in terms of, being a solid striker and being a decent enough grappler, he seems to have all those chops. Now, he's going up against Danny Hartwell, who I said, city kickboxing prospect, went 11-2 as an amateur. He turned pro back in January, and he was able to get the submission in the first round against his opponent in Aries FC. Looks like a brute of a man, very thick, very physical, very strong, has some decent striking. Grappling seems to be a little bit of an issue, although he has pulled off a handful of submissions on the amateur scene. But I think as he continues to take steps up in competition, it'll be harder for him to be successful with that type of approach. I have to lean ever so slightly to the Ariano side. There are still some what ifs about Hartwell, because I want to see him against guys that are actually going to provide legitimate resistance for him. And I think Ariano can meet him, or at least match him in the physicality. And I wouldn't be surprised if Ariano is able to just keep this grindy and clinchy, pushing Hartwell against the cage and keeping him in those bad spots. Striking might be a bit of a wash from either aspect here. I get Hartwell trains out of city kickboxing, but that doesn't automatically mean that he's this spectacular kickboxer. I think Ariano could definitely match him in that spot. So I'm not sure what maybe I'm missing something. I don't understand the huge love on Hartwell that's driving him up to minus 200 in this spot. I'm going to go Ariano by decision, but I'd rather just sit back and kind of watch this fight play out and see what both guys have to offer here. But I am going to go Ariano by decision. All right, next up, Damon Wilson coming in at minus 500, going up against Leandro Camargo, who comes in at plus 375. Now, Wilson is taking this fight on short notice, as is Camargo, and it seemed more so to try to fill out this card a little bit more, but I see this as a very favorable matchup for Wilson, which is why I think this minus 500 line is quite justified. Now, Wilson often utilizes a grapple-heavy approach, utilizing relentless wrestling to push the pace with his opponents and try to keep them in bad spots. But last time around, we saw him use a very solid striking approach, a pressure approach against Ryan Lilly, which eventually broke Lilly and allowed Wilson to eventually get that late first-round finish. He utilizes a lot of forward movement, a lot of pressure, and that usually leads to him breaking his opponents where he can start to take over. Camargo riding a 2-fight winning streak, both of those wins coming by guillotine. I believe the last handful of his wins have come by guillotine, but I don't think this guy's all that good. If you can defend that initial guillotine and those first few submission attempts, he'll more than likely end up breaking, which is why he's only won one of his 5 fights that have gone past the first round. He's beaten up a ton of tomato cans, and he has often found himself breaking and getting finished by other opponents. I think this is a perfect matchup for Wilson to shut down the submission game of Camargo, possibly even push it in the striking realm, eventually breaking the Brazilian fighter and finding a finish within 2 rounds. If we can get decent plus money on the under, none of the totals have been released at the time of this recording, but if there is decent plus money on that under, I'll probably take that, and I wouldn't even mind parlaying Wilson at minus 500 either. All right, next up, we got Michael Tchamou coming in at plus 115, going up against Mantas Kondratavicius, who comes in at minus 145. A ton of love coming in on Tchamou over the last 24 hours, as he was closer to plus 170 when I initially researched this matchup, and now he finds himself down at that plus 115 range, and I think people are understanding the physicality and danger that he provides early in his fights. He did have a 3-fight losing streak, which he has now transformed into a 3-fight winning streak, finishing all 3 of those opponents in the first round. It's a bit of a shame that he's fighting on this unplugged version of Cage Warriors, whereas he could have just been placed on tomorrow or the following day's card and fought in front of an audience because of how chaotic and entertaining his fights normally are. He has only ever reached round 3 once, and he has only ever reached round 2 3 times. He's all action, all gas, either finishing opponents very quickly or ending up getting finished himself late in round 1 or ending up in round 2 as well. Nasty power, has a decent guillotine front choke, but for the most part, he wants to walk you down and land big power. His opponent, Mantas Kondratavicius, has his only loss actually coming to a current Aries FC champion. That's a fight where he was unable to get off on his early finishing ways, ended up falling short and getting finished in the second round of that fight. And he's a guy that often utilizes a karate stance, crashing that pocket and providing a lot of pressure to his opponents, even getting into the clinch where he tries to look to get opponents to the ground and tries to break them there. He's still just 25, so he can definitely be making improvements to try to round out his game a little bit better. But he's similar to Tchamou in the fact that he wants to go out there and get finishes ASAP. Now, technically speaking, I do believe that Mantas is the better fighter here, but I don't know if he's going to be ready for the pace, pressure, and power that Tchamou will be throwing in return. Look for Mantas to look to get this fight to the ground, to try to stay away from the majority of danger from Tchamou, and that's where I think Kondratavicius will end up winning this matchup. But at the line, I kind of wish that I got in on Tchamou around that plus 170 line. At plus 115, this is closer to roughly where the fight should be lined, but this is a very chaotic fight. I don't want to have action on either side here, as I believe both guys are capable of finishes. The better fighter is Kondratavicius, but the more dangerous fighter is Tchamou. So sit back, enjoy this fight. Maybe take the under if they do release it at a decent enough line. But I'm going to go with the Lithuanian fighter here to get his hand raised. All right, next up, we We got Matthew Camilleri coming in at minus 170, going up against David Jacobsson, who comes in at plus 140. Now, starting off on the Camilleri side, who's riding a 2-fight winning streak now. The last time we saw him lose was against Adam Shelley in a matchup where he got off on his wrestling style, but unfortunately, Shelley was the one dishing out more damage and ended up getting the judges to score the fight in his favor. And that often what comes down in Camilleri's fights. He's going to get the takedowns, but he needs to get better in terms of shutting down the damage his opponents are inflicting on him so that he can make it look convincing enough should the fight end up hitting the scorecards. He's done a great job in terms of pinning opponents against the cage when he gets them to the ground, figure fouring their legs so it's harder for them to get up, and then from there trying to get his head above his opponent's head and then start dishing out a little bit damage. Even if it's chippy choppy shots, any damage is better than just holding on to his opponents. He trains out of the same gym as Paddy Pimblett. He's a BJJ purple belt, and he turned 29 back in November. Very solid prospect here, especially with the pace and pressure he normally brings to the table, and not a lot of opponents are able to keep up with that. Now, he's going up against David Jacobsson, who made his return after a year away from action after he had finished a 7-18 opponent. He normally showcases a decent striking style, often dealing with opponents that look to take him to the ground. He has struggled to stay all that consistent in terms of getting cage time recently, as he had no fights in 2023, and now it's been a year away since he fought back in 2024. He's been able to get some decent winning streaks going, but whenever he faces someone notable, he ends up coming up short. And there are often opponents that are able to continuously take him to the ground and keep him there. He'll often sell out for submissions, whether it's guillotines or Kimuras, but that often puts him in bad positions where better grapplers are going to be able to keep him on his back. And I think that's what we're going to see here with Camilleri, who is getting some love from the public as he was closer to minus 140 just yesterday. Now he's finding himself at minus 170, and I have to agree with that line movement. I think Camilleri's grappling will end up being too much for Jacobsson, and Jacobsson will be fighting too much off of his back, but I think Camilleri's BJJ defense will be on point to stay out of too much danger in that realm, and then just keeping Jacobsson on the defensive, keeping him on his back, pinned against the cage, and grinding this fight out to win it on the scorecards. All right, main event time, where we got Anthony Orozco coming in at minus 450, going up against Andre Augusto, who comes in at plus 350. Now, Orozco taking this fight on short notice after the original main event fell out between George Hardwick and Lucas Clay, and he accepted the short notice call up here, especially against a very tough opponent like Andre Augusto. Orozco, very physical, very tough fighter to deal with, very powerful in the striking realm, very physical in the grappling realm, taking opponents down and then smashing them from that top position. He's 6-0, went 9-1 as an amateur. He's 5-0 now and went 9-1 as an amateur, with his lone defeat on the amateur scene coming against a guy that is now 6-0 as a pro. Trains out of the MMA Fight Academy, which is the gym that the Cage Warriors promotion opened up in San Diego to try to cultivate some talent over there. And he looks to have the goods. He's athletic, he's physical, he's strong, he's powerful, looks to have a ton of potential, still young enough to be making that springboard into the next phase of his career, and, very much focused on the MMA game. Now, he's going up against Andre Augusto, who actually already has a win in this 2025 calendar year, where he was able to get a split decision victory over a 3-0 opponent back in February. In November, he lost to Cage Warriors prospect Sean Clancy Jr., who's going to be headlining a card in the coming months. Augusto, a little bit of a tank of a man. He's always going to be outsized at this weight class, but he's just short, stocky. Kind of reminds me of Husamar Palhares ever so slightly. Maybe not as nasty with the submissions, but very grindy and physical, especially when he can establish that top position. That's how we saw him pull off that upset victory in September over Chris Bungard over the course of 15 minutes, grinding him out, getting those top positions and keeping it there. But I think he's going to struggle to do that against Orozco, who's very very good in terms of scrambling out of bad positions should he find himself there. The only thing that gives me a little bit of pause is the amount of experience that Augusto has here. Because if he can actually establish that top position, it's going to be hard for Orozco to try to battle back from any type of flaw that he finds himself in, or if he finds himself behind at all early on in this matchup. Augusto had some decent success against Clancy Jr. before being finished in the third round, but I think Orozco is just too physical. I think he's too strong. I think he's too big, and I think that's going to cause Augusto a ton of trouble. With that said, minus 450 is not a line I want to be tying myself to when you're at such a experience discrepancy, and with some of the sneaky submissions and sneaky takedowns we've seen Augusto pull off in the past. This might be a little bit more challenging for Orozco than it should, but he should get the job done. He should possibly even get the finish, but I don't want any part of that at minus 450, nor do I want to try to take the gamble on the plus 250 dog either. So I'm going to pass on this fight, but I'll go Orozco inside the distance. All right, there you guys go. Cage Warriors 184. All 8 fights broken down for you guys. Reminder, I'll be back tomorrow to break down Cage Warriors 185, which is a 16-fight card as of right now. Knock on wood, nothing falls off there. But also later today, I'll be dropping the Locky 2-step / Locky Trinity free parlay. And tomorrow, the UFC Vegas 104 prop drop. So make sure you guys stay tuned for that. All right, I'll catch you guys later today for the free parlay. Peace.